I'm seeing a succession of events. It seems like that plays out over possibly a number of years. And it's almost like a reset because of the debt ceiling and all the talks we're hearing about the debt ceiling. The spending is unsustainable. And, it seems like, John, that it's almost on purpose.
Chris, as we're going to move on to something else that God showed you. I mean, you told me before we hit record about this dream, and you called it headlines from the future. But tell me about this man in black and this $50 bill.
Yeah. So this was actually in March of 2022. So we're talking well over a year ago, before a lot of the economic problems, started happening. And the dream that I had about the $50 bill, that was what it was called. It kind of, I guess you might say, went viral. But I want to read it to you here because I believe it's significant in the sense that I believe this dream. And by the way, shortly after this, we sat down, consulted with some people that work in the intelligence world, and they said some of the words in this, like you would have to have access to intelligence, national intelligence, to have even been able to use the words the way that you use them. And there are people in the intelligence community that believe in the prophetic and want, to prevent, terrorism, counterterrorism, things like that. Well, anyway, without divulging too much about that, this was had on in March of 2022. And the $50 bill, I've come to believe, represents the monetary value of the 50 United States, or the current dollar, the petrodollar. So here it is. I saw an unknown man dressed in a black suit, and he held a $50 bill in his hand. And in the dream, he tore the $50 bill in 3 stages. The first one, he stayed in front of me. He took the $50 bill and he tore off 1/3 of the $50 bill. And when he tore off 1/3 of the $50 bill, this triggered, people started coming up and handing me newspapers and then running off. Okay. So the first headline that was brought up to me says this, quote, "The dollar drops 30% in value," unquote, and a subtitle which read, quote, "Mideast oil strikes deal with China instead of the U.S., unquote. I then saw another headline which was given to me, which said, "The perfect storm," subtitled, "Inflation reaches a new high." I was handed another headline which said, quote, "Food shortage crisis as wheat and bread imports are at a stalemate," unquote. Another headline was handed to me which said something like, quote, "Riots and civil unrest as citizens demand entitlement checks." So then this is the second stage. And I don't know how long this takes to play out, but it seems like it's a total reset on the financial system. The second part, the man dressed in black takes the rest of the $50 bill after 1/3 had previously been torn off. He takes the rest of it and tears it in half. And when he did this, an earthquake happened under my feet, and another person walked up to me and handed me a headline which read, quote, "Israeli and Palestinian 2-state solution reached," unquote. Another headline was handed to me by another person which read, quote, "Major earthquake hits the middle of the U.S., unquote. Then the man in black took the rest of the $50 bill and started tearing it into smaller pieces one by one. Another person walks up, hands me a headline which said, quote, "America in pieces," subtitled, "More states secede from the nation in rebellion to the federal government." Fourthly, the man in black took out a new dollar bill. But what was interesting about it, the $1 bill looked like a cell phone. Okay, it looked like a $1 bill, but it was a cell phone. It did have George Washington's face on it, of course, the founding president, but it looked very different. And I remember looking at it, and as I looked at it, someone else came up to me and handed me another newspaper headline, and its headlines read, quote, "New currency for a renewed nation, unquote, unquote. Another headline was handed to me and it said, quote, simplicity restored as Americans grow their own food again, unquote. And that was the end of the dream. I had that in Moravian Falls at one of our properties Morningstar has up in Moravian Falls, North Carolina.
Wow. So, I mean, you're talking about the digital dollar right there. I mean, that's something that we hear inklings of or whispers of. And, but it seems that what God spoke to you in March of 2022 through this dream, is that correct? It was March?
March of 2022. Yeah. So
March of 2022. I'm sorry. Yeah. So we're recording this in May. And so that's
of 2023, right?
Of 2023. So that's 15 months before now that God has spoken to you about this.
Yeah.
As you're seeing things come to light in our world today, as you're seeing some of these things come to pass, what's going on in your mind?
Well, I'm looking at this dream and I'm seeing a succession of events. It seems like that plays out over possibly a number of years. And it's almost like a reset because of the debt ceiling and all the talks we're hearing about the debt ceiling. The spending is unsustainable. And, it seems like, John, that it's almost on purpose. For years they had to balance the budget. The U.S. federal government does, just like your household has to, mine does.
Absolutely.
It seemed like for the last number of years, they've not cared. They just spent money and kept printing it and printing it and printing it. And I think they did that because they knew the ultimate goal was to go to the digital dollar, to hit the reset. That's why they haven't cared about how much they've spent. Now, I sat down, as I said, with the intelligence community, shared this dream with them. This is one of the things we do at Morningstar, is train and equip people on how to discern whether dreams are from God and how to interpret them. But I sat down with an intelligence team and a man named John Redenbow, who this was the interpretation that we came up with. It was a very vivid, intense dream. The dream is an unfolding of events in the future that we must be prepared for, right? We don't get in fear. We just get prepared for it. God has always provided a Goshen for his people when he's delivering them out of Egypt. When the plagues come, God's always given us a Goshen. So the key word is preparation, not fear. So we sat down and we came to some conclusions. And once again, I want to stress, I use this verse a lot. We know in part, we prophesy in part.
Exactly. Yeah.
None of us have the whole. Okay. And so I think that's when we get into error in prophecy and is when we pretend like our piece of the pie is the whole pie. But we all have a part. And if we bring our parts together, we can make the pie whole. So the man in black, I do believe this was an angel that I saw in this dream, and it was a sign of judgment. But here's the interesting thing. God will often speak to us in the language that he knows we're familiar with. The man in black reminds me of Johnny Cash.
Okay.
$50 bill dream. Johnny Cash, the man in black. And what's interesting is one of the headlines was a quote from Revelation chapter 6, the black horse rider pertained to economic principles. Remember, a measure of wheat for a penny. And so one of the headlines was wheat and bread imports were at a stalemate. And of course, right now, Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, and their harvest is going to be affected because of the war going on over there. So the U.S. $50 bill represents the economic condition, the monetary value of the 50 United States. Johnny Cash had some songs. Now, how bizarre is this? Here are some names of some of his songs entitled, quote, "When the Man Comes Around," unquote.
Okay.
He in the song, he quotes Revelation 6, the black horse rider. He had a song called "The Man in White." Johnny Cash also was in the Air Force. His first job, you can't make this up, in the Air Force he was a decoder. Meaning when information was given through the Morse code, his job was to interpret it to receive the intelligence. That's what dream interpretation is.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the bill was torn in 3 stages. It escalates a series of events. The tearing of the 1/3 of the bill drops the value of the dollar 30%, which means it seems like it's tied to an oil deal reached between the Middle East and China. And this seems to go along, with the whole idea of the value of the dollar dropping, which means, of course, inflation. So the dollar loses its value. And I think recently, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, actually was reprimanded by the European Union for giving a speech saying that they should invest in other monetary systems other than the US dollar, that the US dollar should not be the reserve for the world. And so it just seems like things are being set up for that. Then it led to high inflation, food shortage, supply chain issues. The next headline seemed to say that this would cause some Americans to, because of the food crisis and the economic crisis and the dropping of the dollar of the value, Americans would demand entitlement and welfare assistance to eat, to survive. The next stage, he tore the bill in half, which seemed to be tied to the U.S. supporting the 2-state solution in the Middle East, dividing Jerusalem. And it was like, as a consequence of that, us supporting that, or the administration supporting that it would divide America with an earthquake in the middle of the U.S. The third stage, he tore the rest of the $50 bill in pieces, which seemed to represent states seceding from the Union because of some issue they had with the federal government. And this escalated to the point where the military had to get involved to help bring things under control. I think this is tied to the southern border. Now, let me explain what I mean.
Okay.
Most of the people that are coming up across the southern border, right? I mean, it's illegal immigration, granted, but most of those are decent people. I'm sure they just want a better life. But, you read headlines, you see that, a most wanted FBI list terrorist was recently apprehended at the southern border. The cartels, the drug traffickers, the human traffickers, the sex traffickers. I think something is going to be found out because of the dereliction of duty of the administration, just letting people come across the border, pretending as if the border is not open and saying, no, it's not open, but we all know that it is. And thousands of people are flooding in the U.S. every day. I think something will be found out that by the federal government allowing this to happen, when the American people find out what was allowed to come across and what it brought into the nation. I'm not just talking about the fentanyl and the trafficking, but I think something specific will be found out. It will trigger such outrage that it will cause the American federal government to fear the American people, the consequences.
Wow.
States seceding because if the federal government is not going to do, not going to protect us, we'll take matters into our own hand as a state, and we'll protect ourselves. And Texas and Arizona are starting to do that to a degree now, especially Texas, putting their own National Guard and stuff at the border because, the federal government isn't doing. I'll finish up. The last part of the dream was the $1 bill, which seemed to speak of the nation will become one again after some secession division, but it will be tied to the face of George Washington, meaning we will only become one when we go back to our founders' principles.
Wow.
That's what the face of George Washington means. And it seems to appear as if there will be this desire for Americans to be self-sustainable again, to grow their own food again. And it'll be a new kind of currency when the nation is renewed. And I think that's why the federal government doesn't care about how much money they spend, because they know the ultimate plan is to get us off the dollar. They got us off the gold standard decades ago. And so this is ultimately allowing them to print money like it's just pouring water And they're doing it because they know the ultimate goal is to hit the reset button and get off the dollar and go to the digital dollar.
Wow. So when God speaks to you in these dreams, like, how long did you keep this to yourself before you brought it public? And how long did you ponder this? I'm always, I consider what is it? Mary, she pondered those things in her heart that the angel told her. And so obviously she had to wait several months before everybody else knew what was going on. So as a prophetic voice, as a trusted prophetic voice, when you receive something like this, can you tell us a little bit about the vetting process that you go through and the other people that are speaking into some of these things?
I think this is the value of team ministry. I am the president of Morning Star Ministries, but Rick Joyner, our founder for years, Bob Jones, more than 20 years was on staff here. He was around. We have other leaders here, Tom Hardiman, Dave Yarnes, people that have been around for a long time. And so, number one, I go by the philosophy. Number one, God does like to share things with his friends. And some of those things are not meant to be told. They're secrets. Mm-hmm. And because God just enjoys sharing his most intimate secrets with his friends. And there are many things I've not shared that God has told me not to share, that it was like a matter of me earning his trust by not talking about them. But as soon as I had this dream, I knew this was serious. So the very next day, as I said, I was in Moravian Falls, which is about an hour and a half north of Fort Mill, South Carolina, which is where Morning Star is on the old PTL property. We're just 15 minutes south of Charlotte. But I was an hour and a half north up in Moravian Falls, and I called Rick Joyner, who's a general in the faith. He's also been around for years. And he heard this, and this is, our whole team felt like this was God. This was without a doubt the Lord speaking in dreams and visions. One of the ways the Lord has used me, and there's several videos of this on my YouTube channel, Chris Reed Ministries, where I've actually stood from stage ministering, and I will go into a vision. The Lord will show me a dream that someone has had in the crowd.
Wow.
And then I will give them the interpretation. So it's not just dream interpretation, but there are many times. In fact, just recently, some of them are more detailed dreams than others, but just recently, I called somebody out and I saw this dream in detail. The man stood, I called him out by name. And so dreams is a way that God speaks to me. It's not, I wouldn't say the primary way that he does. Most of the times it's visions and impressions, and I hear. But that is a common thing. That's like Daniel 2, where remember the king was troubled. He couldn't remember this dream. So He called the astrologers. They couldn't help him. He calls Daniel. Daniel seeks the Lord, and the Lord gives Daniel the dream of the king, actually what he dreamed, and then he gives him the interpretation. So I think it's just a matter of spiritual maturity. Hebrews 4:15 says, strong meat belongs to those who are mature age or full age, to be able to develop their spiritual senses to discern between good and evil. And so, I think when people desire to go beyond the milk of the word, elementary Christianity, and go into the deeper things of God, biblically based, I think God wants to reveal his secrets to his friends. And he'll do that for every person watching whose heart is pure and who wants to know what the Lord is saying.
With the woke world constantly encroaching, we need to keep our eyes focused on what is true. Charisma News is breaking news from a spiritual perspective, and you can trust that we won't ever waver from biblical truth as we deliver the headlines to you so that you can get the full story. Set your browser to charismanews.com to get connected and come back every day for breaking news from a spiritual perspective. Go to charismanews.com.